Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining the Behind Company Lines podcast. Today we have Brett Turner, founder and CEO of Trovata. Trovata empowers everyone to analyze, report, forecast, transact, manage cash like a pro, no matter who your business banks with, no IT required. Brett, I'm so excited to chat with you, not only from your wealth of experience as a founder and entrepreneur, but also what you're building at Trovata and really just the differences I think you can illuminate a lot of us on as founders on how to transact at different levels of businesses, how to incorporate your company in their flow and their growth, and would really love to learn more about that. But before we get into all that with Trovata, what were you doing before you started the company?
Yeah, no, great to be on the show, Julian. Yeah, it's been a journey. As you can see, I got a little bit of gray hair there, right? So a little more than 20 years experience. Started out as a CPA and I didn't last in the auditing world at Deloitte very long. I quickly got tired of that quickly, but I just gravitated into startups and just have always, I got into which is an odd thing to do, kind of get into accounting if you want to be an
Yeah,
entrepreneur. But at the time it was just really, where can I go and develop some good grounding skills, learn about business, get enough
yeah,
to be dangerous, and then kind of go from there. So it was a great way to learn, and finance, accounting, you learn about and especially like what we're doing now in terms
yeah,
of cash flow. It's always been at the heart of what I've been doing, and cash is
yeah,
the lifeblood of every business. So if
yeah,
everything is sort of grounded in cash, you pretty much are going to touch cash. You're going to learn a lot about every
mm,
aspect of transacting throughout business. So that was this career as a controller and in
yeah,
early stage startups. Spent some time at Amazon managing their SEC reporting, and this is back when they first launched Amazon Prime back in
yeah,
2004. 2005 was in their corporate finance group, and then from there we moved into a CFO role. So managed a part of three high growth venture backed startups over the course of about a little more than a decade. All of those three companies were all selling into the enterprise, regulated industries, kind of these harder businesses. All of those raised a little more than 100 million across those three. All three of those thankfully scaled and successfully
yeah.
sold. And sort of the next big thing was what next? And then here comes Trovata.
Yeah. Well, it's so fascinating thinking about even early on, like your perspective into businesses and seeing how they operate. And what were you seeing kind of, was there anything surprising in terms of where the cash flow was coming in or how businesses were operating? Were they operating at a deficit or were they actually profitable? What were you seeing that was common and maybe even surprising at the time?
Yeah, I think I was a little bit of what I was so curious and fascinated by is that here, even in the accounting world, you had all this ERP systems or accounting systems, you had all of this data, but it really, if you're just going to use it for closing the books or producing the financial statements, I mean, how helpful really is that? I mean, especially today's day and age, they've become so compliant driven. So are you really going to operate your business off of financial statement? There's just so much more in-depth insight that you needed. So early on in my career, the part that sort of, I don't know, helped me a lot and of just, it was building a data warehouse in those days, getting your data out of your ERP system, and then unlocking all of this trove of data, all this valuable insights, and then gleaning those insights, putting it in a way, kind of get it to your front line or customer facing decision makers. I mean, if it's in
Yeah.
their hands, they're going to be able to utilize it in a powerful way that's really going to drive impact and help your business. So that was early on discovering that, and that just became a lot of fun because the more I did that, they
Yeah.
appreciated it. They felt like armed with real great data to help
Yeah.
them. But then it created this bi-directional flow because then they were starting to teach me about the business, why it mattered, and that was really valuable too.
Yeah. But it's fascinating. Like, is that just a function of most businesses just having that like disconnect or distance between these two seemingly, I guess they're kind of a cause and effect, but really there's a relationship between them two because you can understand pricing models that much more. You can understand your return on investment, your cost per acquisition. It's like illuminating to how your business actually acquires customers on the front side versus how all this operating cost affects your overall profits. Right. Is that just a function of a business to be separate like that or yeah.
Yeah,
Or if
I mean, there's all this data there, and you kind of have two different things that are happening. You've always heard like, and whether you're kind of managing your own finances personally, right? You get a sense of, or if you're even in a small business, you look at the P&L and you say, hey, our business made $1 million, but then you're like, it doesn't feel like we made $1 million because what? Everything was going out of our bank account so much faster than what is reflected on the financial statements. Like, what's going on? What gives? And I think that that aspect of just cash flow and all the
Yeah.
timing differences. And then you have all of this in your accounting system that's really governed by this thing called GAAP.
Yeah.
That's really driving as a standard, all of the way you have to account for things according to the SEC ultimately. So when you kind of look at these different ways, you have all this information that's sort of locked in your ERP system. And then you have all this live, living, dynamic cash flow. And at the end of the day, it gets pretty easy. This, you have a little more time to account for your month end process, month end close. We all know that, right? And your finance team is doing that. But then on the cash side, it's like, at the end of the day, it's pretty simple. I need to make sure that I have more cash coming in than than what's going out. And if that equation doesn't work out on a day-to-day basis, then you've got problems, and that's
Yeah.
liquidity. So that sort of sums it up. And so at the end of the day, like, you have all of this data, and then what do you do with it?
Right. Right. And fast forward a little bit, thinking about your time as a VP of finance and CFO, when you were coming into companies, what was the state of that whole process and seeing the cash flow? Were they running at a sophisticated level, or was there a lot that needed to be kind of puzzled together and brought together to really understand and scale that company? Because without knowing where you are at a baseline, it's impossible to build on top of that. Because then it's like a Jenga tower, right? With pieces pulled out.
Yep.
At some point it's going to topple. But what were you coming in? What were companies operating at for when you would come in, and what did you have to do to get them to be efficient and effective and understand their cash
Yeah.
flow?
I think early on it was, so I just kind of built up a little bit of a specialization of just kind of helping kind of get an early stage companies ducks in a row. You typically hired because the board is saying to the founders or the early stage folks, like, you need a little more discipline. You need a finance person. So kind of that first finance person coming in, helping kind of mature the company in a way. And usually, yeah, it's building some process, but some discipline around budgeting and planning and those kind of things. And so, yeah, you are cleaning up a lot. You're kind of, there's a lot of stuff. So I think at the end of the day, that's, I would say, par for the course. And in the startup world, which makes it fun also, which makes it daunting for, maybe it's not everybody's cut out to do it because it is hard, but you're really reinventing the business every few months. And that's happening rapidly in the early going. As the business starts to slowly mature, maybe it's every 6 months, then it starts to lengthen as you go. But because of that, it's a very disruptive process. It's very dynamic. It's changing all the time. So naturally things are going to build up, and you need to be able to handle that. But even so, my first 3 startups, it was probably more what not to do than to do. And there's a couple of them were fairly high profile. One of them was this company, Teledesic, which was broadband via satellite before the days of Elon and Google putting satellites up. I mean, that was way ahead of its time, right? $1 billion capitalization by Bill Gates and Craig McCaw, the big tech pioneers in Seattle. And so, but it also was a spectacular failure, right? So you started learning. Thankfully, I wasn't really a founder in those days. I was the person that was more of a junior executive, but just incredible learnings when those things are happening. So take advantage of it, learn. There's only upside, because when you have those failings, you're kind of learning along the way. And that for me was an incredible education over the first 7-8 years of my career. When I went to Amazon after that, was really taking a break for a little bit before becoming a CFO, take a break from startups. And I thought, okay, I'm going to learn so much about how it's done. Amazon then even still was relatively small to where it is today. It was 8 billion in revenue, but still 8 billion in revenue is not a small company. But even then, coming in and managing all the subsidiaries worldwide and consolidation and tax accounting, a lot of complex areas, there was also, surprisingly, there was a lot of stuff that felt like cleanup on aisle 5. There was a lot of that at Amazon. It's like, how can that happen? This is big companies. But at the end of the day, in those days, Amazon is growing really fast. So wherever there's growth, there's going to be a lot of dynamic things happening. And usually in finance, you're also going to see great insights, but you're also probably going to see a little bit of the chaos behind the curtain as well.
Yeah, it's almost like in engineering, right? It's like technical debt. Like you almost expect that as you scale and grow your product from MVP to next version and beyond. I'm not sure if you have a story that you could share of a time where, one of the companies you've either worked at as an executive or as a founder was having, say, a cash flow problem, and how did you turn it around? Was it something that had to do with the product, how you were operating internally, and what you were paying for from a procurement standpoint? Yeah, any stories or any anecdotes
Yeah.
that you could share where you had that issue and you turned it around and how you did so?
I would say it's probably one of the biggest ones is really relative to it's sort of the early days of what Trovata was, the company that I'm part of now. It was, so right after Amazon, left there in 2005 to run finance for and IT for a company called Worldwide Packets. And it had kind of a storied beginning because one of the original founder of that business was one of the two inventors of Ethernet. So the Ethernet cable, like he was one of his name was Bernard Daines. And so he put 30 million of his own money into this company and had sort of he moved up from Silicon Valley. He grew up in Spokane, Washington. So I moved from Seattle to Spokane. It's not a big startup community in Spokane, right? So, but oddly, it was based there, but that's where he grew up. He was putting a bunch of money in. So he was going to do that wherever he was going to do it, right?
Yeah.
So I moved from Seattle. It was after, though, that company went through a lot of turbulence because it started around 2001, the internet, the bubble bursting in those days. And then it kind of went through a really rough economic patch. And then the company was reinventing itself. Madrona, the big VC out of Seattle, or kind of the main VC there, was jumpstarting the company with the new round. I came in with a few other executives to kind of help as part of that journey. And so, but right away, so here's kind of the set and scene, right? Right away, my first stint as really a CFO in a CFO role, I'm going into a board that's got the early investors who have been there for a long time, and then the new investors who came in on the recap round. And right away, it's just all basically financial VCs around the table.
Yeah.
And right away, of course, people were asking me cash-oriented questions, like all about cash flow. Nobody cared about like the more of the traditional finance metrics. It's all about cash burn, cash utilization. Hey, we're spending all this money on this new flagship product. Like, how much did we spend last month? Right? It's all these very real things. And there were questions that were really hard to ask, or what was what's called in finance, the quote to cash cycle. So just seeing the efficiency of cash from the time you're building up a product, have inventory, you have logistics, you're supplying that on a sale. We use big channel partners like AT&T or Luce and Alcatel through big customers like AT&T or Comcast. So everything has this life cycle, and there's all these touch points. And if there's any inefficiencies along the way, like cash is getting stuck. And we'd raised $60, $70 million, but even so, that's a pittance when you're competing against like Cisco and Juniper. So everything was like cash utilization. And when I didn't have good answers, then even our own executive team is looking at me like, hey, aren't you the finance guy? How do you not know that? Aren't these basic finance questions? They seem like it to us. And so it was hard. It's like, it's feel like I don't have the answers. It's making me look bad, and I'm making our team look bad. So that's when I basically, after it was like the third meeting, I finally just said, forget it. I'm basically going to figure this out. And I went to work building this cash flow model and this forecasting model. And then right away would have some results, but then I kept making it better and better. And it took me about a year moonlighting, kind of on the side, building this. And it basically allowed us to get really, really precise on forecasting cash through that entire cycle. So then it was maybe the 2 or 3 meetings in, coming in there, and one of our board members who's always asked the most critical questions, we started throwing out questions like AR turns and all these different cash flow questions. And it was like, oh, no problem. I start rattling off all these answers. And then the board's like, oh, this is it. And so there, it just really started to set the tone, and you could see the confidence just lift. But everybody on our side of the table, the management team, it's like, hey, we know our stuff. We know our business. We understand all the cash implications. And that had a big confidence boost to everybody, and it carried over. And even the board, some of the VCs were then telling their CFOs, their portfolio companies, saying, hey, you got to call, I want to introduce you to Brett to get this this special model. And then to call me, and it's like, well, it's not really a product. So I don't know. Do you really want this? Or the CFO would call me, he's like, hey, you're making me look bad over here. Like, you're supposed to have some secret model. Like, what's up? So, but that whole aspect was just so critical. And that's, it really impressed upon me that when you know, if you understand the underlying cash flow and all the implications on the business, and you can visualize, you can see it, you could tell that story, it's just really impactful to not only just
Yeah.
help you as a company, but it just carries over to everybody across the team.
Yeah. What's fascinating to think about, like, what were the sort of variables or indicators to kind of help you predict where things would go? I'm sure because of the flow and where it had to stop, whether it's through vendors or procurement or investing in certain parts of the business, there's a certain maybe latency when that cash would be freed up. And what were some of those signals that you started to see and build upon that predicted or allowed you to predict with almost like a complete accuracy how much time it would take to, or from cash being created to cash being utilized?
Yeah, what we did was we it was sort of kind of pioneering getting access to banking data, so transactions, balances, and then basically creating this bottoms up cash flow model. And then it was getting some of the intelligence from the the ERP system to then augment that. Like, what were the underlying flows? If there's a transaction, what does it mean? What is it? Why do we spend this money? And so, or what does this deposit mean? Is it a deposit from a customer, or is it from an investor, or what? So you look at these. So at the end of the day, when you kind of have to build a bit of a closed loop. If it's just part of it, it's hard to glean the insides because it's kind of you're getting part of the story. You don't have all the context. So the key was closing the loop. And when you can kind of get this fully end to end aspect, like, and then we would have this opening of a week cash balance, all your activity that happened during the week, all categorized by functional type, and then end of week balance. It was basically like a P&L, except cash based. All the things you might learn in Finance 101 is like, oh, cash accounting is child's play. It's all about accrual. And there's accrual based accounting is what runs financial statements for investors and SEC reporting and all that. But just the core aspects of cash flow allows anybody, any business operator to they understand their business. They understand what the X's and O's mean. And when you have that, like, it's just an incredible operating tool. So it helped.
Yeah.
That was it. You could kind of see. So I could basically see if basically the cash flow that was paying, let's say our vendors for suppliers that ultimately had led to building up product that went into inventory. And if you kind of see that started building up, it was an early warning sign of like, okay, we might be building up too much inventory relative to our distribution or our sales and fulfillment. And if we start doing that, then you don't want to do that. You're going to have all your cash is sitting in a warehouse in this product that you've built up, and you don't want that. You want customers buying it and shipping it out the door. You're recognizing revenue off that. You're getting paid off that, right? So these were important things where in a lot of companies you get these stumbling blocks and you get this congestion, and yet in that whole process, it allowed us to see that and manage it more effectively, have really good stats and measurement, so we could try to avoid those problems.
Yeah.
When you're a startup, even for us, that we'd raised a lot of money and it's sort of a bigger stake startup, but still, like, you're still operating on a pretty thin margins of risk in terms of cash, right? So if you start burning too much, you might then have to raise money more quickly. That's going to have an impact on your cap table. Can you raise it at that time? That time. So that all of those have really big implications. That's why cash is so important.
Yes. In thinking about obviously the journey from when you first kind of conceived this Trovata and now to what it is today, what's kept your company steady, and what in particular have you faced times where you're at risk of say running out of runway or not having the cash flow you need to operate? And who did you lean on in that time? As being a founder is a lonely kind of a job, unfortunately. But
Yeah.
there are certain people in your network that come out to kind of aid you at times like that. And would love to hear that, just kind of how that journey, how'd you stay steady, but also times where you felt like
Sure.
things were really at risk. Yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely a journey, and it's not easy. And no matter, so Trovata is my 7th startup. So even so, you always think every time though, it's like, oh, it's going to be bigger, better, faster, all that. And at the end of the day, like, there's no shortcuts to building a great company. It's always hard. And there's always these moments where there certainly is this time. This was probably the most risk that I'd spent. In previous ones, I had founding partners. So you kind of lean on each other a little bit. This one, I started the business solo. It was harder. Now, at the same time, I'm a huge believer because one of the core aspects, just even our culture, is all about the team. So
Yeah.
you have to have people around you. You have to people that you're doing this journey together, and surrounding yourself with really great people who are going to help you is just so key in those moments, because you are gonna get tested, and tested a lot and often. So you got to persevere through that. But yeah, it's definitely a journey. And in terms of the other thing that's kind of helped, just having a finance background, one of the things really early on for me as more of an operator in startups was really what's called a financial operating plan. And what that is, and a lot of, if you're a founder that has an engineering background, you can relate to your product roadmap, right? So
Yeah.
in the same ways, it's sort of your financial roadmap. And what it does do is it, when you're when you build that out, and nobody enjoys doing it, it's hard, and you have to, because what it does is it forces you to think through every aspect of how you're going to make money, how you're going to make payroll, who you can hire, when you can hire them, all those kind of things.
Mhm.
So all of that aspect goes into that. And yeah, you have to answer those questions, and you have to answer them honestly. And it is sort of a closed loop process, because that's how finance works. So
Yeah.
you have to, you have to answer it more completely, end to end. So by doing that, though, going through the business, thinking ahead, it's like you're visualizing what happens in month 3 and year 3, and you're thinking out. You don't have to get too far, but you're going out at least a year to 2 years, and therefore understanding, if I raise this amount and I raise $3 million seed round, how far is that going to get me? And is that far enough? What's ultimately the milestone I have to achieve? And then kind of working back from that, what does that 3 million give me in terms of, is it going to be enough time? I'm going to have to hire a certain number of people, and all those things. You're then starting to do fairly basic math on how that works, and some of the calendar math to see
Yeah.
that is going to be enough. And I think that aspect is just, I don't think is done enough. Like, it's ingrained in me, but what it does do when you do that, because then you're not really surprised as much. So when things happen, you kind of already know. And in some ways, for a lot of people, finance is a little bit of a scary thing. So it's like, I don't want to ask those hard questions, because, and so then you're almost like you're sort of at risk of hitting the wall. And then you're,
Yeah.
then you're surprised when it happens. The reality is, doing, kind of forcing yourself to kind of go through those paces, is you're going to have a better idea. And when you do, you'll be a little more eyes wide open as you go through that process.
Yeah. And what would you say, like, in terms of insights, I can think about what's helped our company when we're in the process of kind of launching a new product, is this understanding what strategies are going to lead us to get to that objective, and what do we have in place that's maybe not leading us to those positive results. It's a lot of tinkering and back and forth, which is uncomfortable, but it's a little bit, it offers that sense of clarity as you move forward. And it's a lot more, yeah, proactive in a lot of ways to being able to be a little bit more innovative or creative, or even just doing the things that kind of sharpen your product, like customer calls or client calls, or all these things that are not scalable, but really have a lot of longevity. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm curious in terms of your experience too, thinking about, like, how do you define, or were there times where your product, say, reached a certain volume where you kind of had a ceiling of growth, and how did you did you add new products onto that? Did you offer it a different way? As we scale startups, I feel like sometimes we hit ceilings for most of the time, but there's always often some creativity that comes out of that. Were there moments during Trovata where you had to kind of build beyond what you had?
Yeah. I mean, I think my experience is more on the enterprise startup, where usually it's something that you're doing is going to be pretty bold and ambitious. So it has a lot of
Mhm.
runway. So it's usually almost the other side of the risk. You typically have to raise a little bit more money. You're probably going to need a little more people to kind of build and get there. And then when you do it, you'll have a little more runway in terms of, and maybe the market potential is a little bit bigger, right?
Yeah.
It's a little bit higher stakes poker, right? So it's a little more risk,
Yeah.
because there are a little more moving parts. But at the same
Do
time,
you,
I think yeah, go ahead.
yeah, I was gonna say, do you start with like an initial partner in those cases? I feel like I've heard that kind of as a common theme. When you go
Yeah.
enterprises, you almost want that partnership to be able to kind of build through them. Is that where you started? Is that the typical route, or is there different ways about it?
Yeah, I mean, you definitely want it to be a team game as early and often as you can. And I think
Mhm.
that's the biggest part of this too. As I would say, you you definitely want to surround yourself with people who are going to have skills and have things that are just different than you, and maybe how they even think differently than you, right? Now that can be uncomfortable because I think from a team perspective, you have to be really unified. And so
Yeah.
there's kind of two approaches, and this is a big part of kind of our cultural ethos as well. Is you can make the mistake, I think, of hiring a lot of people that are just like you and think and believe and all that stuff. They're like, and they're probably not going to challenge you as much because you guys are going to always be in sync, right? And you're then not going to be very diverse, but you're also at risk to, there's a lot of stuff that you're not seeing. So the beauty about having a very diverse team is that you're covering all these bases. You want every aspect of as diverse as you possibly can. Now, on the flip side, though, if you have you're generally going to hire people that are really gravitated to startups, people who are going to be a little more strong-willed, more passionate, which you want. They're going to be a little more opinionated, right? And so when you have a very diverse team, you're also going to get a whole melting pot of opinions, right? So the key in that, I think, is, and a part of our, like the culture that we have at Trovata is that, like, you have to be able to, it's more of this building that unity is how are you going to do that when you have, and we probably have one of the most, we all know it's no secret, we're probably the most divisive time in our nation's history, right? Nobody can agree on anything. So, and then you have big divides so therefore you need to get there, but then the onus is then tie it all together. And I think that's the piece that you have to be uncomfortable at aspect where there's going to be friction and tension, and knowing that there's really healthy tension and then there's other unhealthy tension. But the big piece of that is that you really have to really become a unified team is you really, if there's any sort of individual agenda or a little bit of an ego or whatever, everybody has to be willing to check those at the door, myself included, because at the end of the day, if we're going to be on mission together, we got to make it about that. And when you do that, that's, I think, also what makes it fun, because then everybody can rally around that common denominator, and then that trust and rapport, and now you're in a groove on what really matters. You'll still have tension, but that's where really good, healthy tension is, kind of that iron sharpens iron. You're really gonna, like, if there'll be an opinion because there's a passion about seeing that the company, if they don't do this, it's gonna cause these consequences. And those are things that forces you to confront and have those conversations. And those are really, really good things. Because at the end of the day, in a startup, it's all about de-risking the pathway. Wherever you can de-risk the business, I mean, that's what it's about. That's going to heighten your chances for success along the way.
Yeah. And thinking about risks and more, whether it's external or internal for Trovata today, what do you view as some of the biggest risks for your company?
Yeah, I think that one of the things that when you start out in every company, you're trying to figure, do you have a good idea? Okay, how are you going to make money, and your go-to-market strategy? And you're kind of going through the whatever checklist you have, right? And then pretty soon you feel like, okay, you might want to do some soft pitches to VCs that because they're going to ask hard questions and do it as if you're truly going to raise money, because if they're going to put money in the line, they're probably going to be really critical, right? So that's good. You want to test your thesis. And when you get through that process and it holds up, I think then you can start to say, okay, do we got something or not? Then it's like, how are we going to execute? Which is an entirely different art and different process. And people are such a key ingredient for that. So I think all along the way, for me, the big thing is once you get into that mode, and that's where Trovata is today, which one of the reasons why I loved maybe having been a lot of gray hair, and some of that is making mistakes, or even better, maybe seeing the mistake, but not actually being in the line of fire sometimes is the best way to do it. You get to learn from that. Other people's mistakes, have mentorships along the way. But when you have all that benefit, you're getting really dialing in and is this worth really pouring yourself into? And I think from that standpoint, what I felt was so excited about Trovata from the very beginning, we had so many of these things going for us. Then it's just about execution risk. And I still think for us, that's our biggest risk. It's execution risk. And when you can get risk in that category, I mean, that's the best place for it to be, because at the end of the day, the only thing holding you back is yourself or your collective team to do it. And those are the things that's where you want it. Because I mean, if you get this aspect, it is about kind of this competing to win, that theme that is kind of the undercurrent, a lot of what you're driving for. I mean, that's where you want that risk to be. And it also makes it that much more fun when you're having those wins along the way, because together, like, you're doing it.
Yeah, there's just when you get it to that point, from at least my experience, it's like you have opportunities to be active and take new creative ways to whether it's target a customer or promote your product or what have you, like as we scale your business. It creates the opportunity for activity, which I'd rather do that than push something against uphill that's not gaining momentum. And thinking about the momentum that you've had at Trovata, what's the long-term vision? If everything goes well, what's the long-term vision for the company that you see it?
Yeah, it's just been so blessed to be on this journey. It's been now going on, start the company really in stealth to kind of spend even time before that. It's sort of, in some ways, for me, it's sort of this 10, 15, 20 years in the making. Like, this is the product that I always wish that I had for so many years of my career, understanding all those aspects of what we do and can identify with so many different finance, accounting, treasury folks out there, right? So I think being in this first couple of years, it's very tenuous. It's very hard. Like anything, there's these moments that I'm looking in the mirror and, or my wife's looking at me saying, really? But you persevere, and because of the excitement, and you know that you're on track, you have that conviction. And I think now that we've been in market now for 4 years, we're getting close to 200 customers. We've got amazing customers. Like, one of our first customers was Sonos, a speaker company, and we got JP Morgan as an investor, and that was interesting, not having our first investor as a bank, because they're referring customers, which that's the best help you can get, right? So that's been a real blessing. So we've got now 4 banks as investors, Capital One and Wells Fargo as well, and NAB out of Australia. And we've got the customers that we have, from Snowflake to Krispy Kreme donuts and DraftKings, all these great customers. So when you look at being able to kind of make that impact, and then it's as the business is scaling, and you just see, you're able to you also see people and hitting strides and kind of growing in ways with the business, and keeping it stride with it, seeing them grow professionally, and just being part of that is really, really rewarding.
Yeah. I love this next section. I call my founder FAQ. So I'm going to hit you with some rapid fire questions, and we're going to see where we get. The first question I always like to ask, just to open it up, what's particularly hard about your job day to day?
I think it's a daily process. You have to be in the details, and you have to be pretty maniacal about it. And that means it's not going away. You can't turn it off. So it's not a normal job. It's definitely a high impact sport. And that's just the way it is. Now, you get the thrills of that. You also get it can be fatiguing, and you have to be able to be somewhat self-aware and regulate, or you find yourself hitting the wall and it's like, I ran too hard today. So, but that kind of goes with the territory, both kind of the pros and cons.
Yeah. Yeah. What's a lot of founders think about the flywheel and getting the flywheel going? Obviously, JP Morgan was such a great partner to yours because of this partnership with them referring customers. I'm sure that was extremely helpful and valuable. How do you, as an early founder, get that flywheel going if you say have little resources, have little network, but have a decent idea about a product market fit, have a lot of traction, gaining momentum? How do you continue that momentum in a landscape where it's just competitive wherever you go, and differentiating yourself is a challenge?
It's a great question. I think, honestly, not every business will have a natural flywheel. And I think that it might mean you're having to work extra hard, because you're having to manually fill a couple of those gaps that it just might not naturally be there, or might not come for a while. So you have to build up. I think for our flywheel, and of course, like a lot of folks, Amazon's virtuous cycle on a napkin. Of course, I worked at Amazon for a little while. So of course, I'm thinking, okay, I want to see that this business has a flywheel built in before I even start it. Wouldn't that be cool? Because if we have that, it's definitely going to make the journey a little easier. And that doesn't mean it happens on its own, though. So we're gonna have to work really hard to kind of establish that. And I think that's our flywheel early on was basically, we were the first company to build APIs in corporate banking. So if you think of, in the world of Plaid or Finicity or Yodlee, it's on the retail core of the bank, or small business and consumer. Those APIs didn't exist. And even then, APIs are slow, and there's still even screen scraping. But in the world of banks, they had to be APIs, because you're talking big customers, has to be secure. And so that whole aspect of, if we can build the APIs and we can bridge that gap for the bank's customers, then the banks will take notice. They'll see the experience that we built on top, that their customers are using, that we did that. And then they're going to say, well, we have more customers than just that. They're going to be interested in us. And then they're going to want to make those referrals. And because those other customers, which they have a lot of and that you want and to work with, they're going to make those intros. And then when they do that, you're getting sales and revenue. And then so that's what started to kind of circulate for us. And once we did more of that, that's where the banks kept investing and partnerships happening. And that's why this aspect for us as a fintech is a little different maybe than the normal fintech. A lot of fintechs are like, hey, we want to disrupt we want to be the bank, or we want to change all that, the status quo, the big institution, we can do it better. And I think there's a lot to that. That needs the banks need to be pushed, because if they don't get that push, they're probably not going to change, right? But in our case, they're also a different way to impact change. And this part of it was a JP Morgan or a Wells Fargo on the large corporate side. That institutional banking is not going away. That's not going to change, or you're not going to. So I think the part of that was, okay, how do we help them? How do we actually help them become tech companies, because they're not, and they know that. Some of them aren't admitting it, especially in the early days. But how do you bridge that gap? And so you kind of build this. You kind of have to, and it's hard to work with banks because they're really slow and they're painfully difficult to work with at times. But if you can establish that, if you can create some patience, if you can kind of find the right ways to connect. And in this era, the breakthrough is banks are now building APIs and investing in those now. So it became a natural way for us to kind of work with them, almost like be their tech arm. And so that became a good way to kind of help them, and it helps us, it helps the customer. It's everybody wins. Not that doesn't always happen in every startup, right? So I learned early on from a mentor, when you're disrupting something, you're always looking at like, how do we win? But he's like, don't forget to ask the question, okay, if you win, who loses? Because nobody's going to go just let you just walk in and take the market. Like somebody's gonna, if you're eating out of their bowl, like they're gonna retaliate in some way, right? So I think all of those things, but for us, it aligned really, really well, and we're able to do that with the banks, and kind of we're kind of still early on in the story.
Well, it's brilliant. I love offering value at that level with this API. And then essentially, my question, it's actually super relevant to what I'm doing now. How are you able to then, once you congregated that amount of value, offered value to the small businesses through this API function, how are you then able to bridge the gap with the relationship with the banks without looking, say, predatory, or like you were doing a bait switch type of technique? Because it's a little bit of a finesse if not done well, versus saying, hey, here's the value we've added to your customers. We feel that we can continue and consistently add this value. I'm sure you've seen it on your side. How can we partner together? Is it about the way you communicate it? Yeah. What are ways you kind of bridge those two sides without, I guess, spoiling relationship?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that for us, identifying what we were going to do, what the bank does and is never going to do. And then for us, there's sort of this growing gap between the banks, the institution of banking, and then the institution of the ERP system or the accounting system, right? And finance is being done, cash, finance on either side, that growing chasm. Nobody's filling the only void. The way it's done today is it's online banking, which is the bank's answer to tech, which is a website with hyperlinks and information. It's not a product, right? So that's the problem. And then what happens? Every customer just uses Excel or spreadsheets to kind of manage and build models and kind of manage your cash. So that's growing and getting worse. It needs to be more automated. Everybody has these needs. And so for us, it was like, okay, if we're going to fill this gap, and if we're successful, we're going to build this product right squarely in this problem space. But we got to recognize that what matters to the bank, it's not doing these things, so we can do them. But if it's something that the bank really wants to do or is doing, probably a good idea not to do that. Thankfully, the banks aren't real tech companies, so it's a pretty good case that they're not doing it. But even on the ERP side, you're having to have interoperability or connect in with, like, integrate with NetSuite or Oracle or SAP, right? So what do those guys want? Well, there's aspects that they need on the cash side, but also don't try to do things maybe on a certain workflow or a payment workflow that they're doing because they kind of pride themselves on doing that piece of it, right? So I think once you kind of identify, again, kind of that, if you're going to win, who's going to lose, like try to understand that really, really well, navigate really, really well. It's going to help you be more focused, but it's
Yeah.
also going to help allow those partners not to be threatened because generally they're going to be incumbents. And then you'll likely create some advocates and some allies, which if they do that, or partnerships, they're likely to kind of open up their Rolodex with customers for you. And so it does provide sort of a little bit of an operating flywheel to that helps as well.
Yeah. Yeah. If I'm able to summarize that, it's identify what incentivizes each party and really figure out if one person succeeds, who doesn't succeed in this model. And then through that process, as you're seeing what alignment you can find, then you essentially kind of reflect on how to continually grow each kind of aspect. And what I guess, I think everyone's idea as a founder of how do I get as much of this automated as possible? Like as many partnerships funneling me in new clients and as much of the value being iterated upon almost in an automated fashion to hone in the product and that expand. And it's just so exciting to see where Trovata is now and how you were able to put those pieces together to get it to where it really does seem like every party is getting value. People are connecting to the right resources. You're not doing things that other companies are trying to do and compete with them, more you collaborate and just providing this inner web. And it sounds like because it's enterprise, the complexity of it is definitely common versus kind of smaller companies.
Yeah. And I know that sounds, it's not always the case. Been in startups for a while where, there's times where you're not going to make friends because you're just flat out going to disrupt this space. There are incumbents there and you're going to poke the bear and they're going to turn around and bite you once in a while. So you have to have a strategy around that too. So I think part of it is just making sure that the biggest thing is you're aware of it. You understand maybe how those reactions are going to take place when you do that. And having a really good strategy on, so you're not caught flat-footed and you expect that nobody's going to give you anything. It doesn't happen in life, right? You gotta be ready. You gotta work hard. You gotta go after it. And I think it's just another one of those things that if you kind of really think through, put yourself in their shoes, how are they going to react? You can navigate through that as best you can. It's not going to be easy, but get unscathed as possible going through the journey of innovation.
Yeah. Second to last question here, because I know we're coming close to time. If you were to think about it, whether it's early in your career or now, what books or people have been impactful to you that have left kind of something with you today?
That's good. I don't know. For me, it's like I'm always kind of get bits and pieces for just so many. Like I just feel like so many people you meet, you like. We're all kind of flawed people in some ways, but you kind of see something that somebody's good at and kind of that's something I can kind of take and learn from. And I think that's been a lot of kind of theme in my career, just from people who I've kind of spent time with innovating. There was a guy, this startup, Worldwide Packets, like a guy that I work closely with, who's probably the best finance operator. This guy, Matt Fry, was a mentor early on for me. He really taught me the value of a really sound operating model and think through it, which makes you a better operator. The CEO of that business, a guy who kind of had won Entrepreneur of the Year in Toronto with the previous startup. He kind of had a big high flyer even prior to that. He told me a story once where he said where his company, he took public and kind of went wire to wire, which was pretty cool. And he said it was one of the junior investment bankers on the team said to him, it's like, man, you guys just came out of nowhere. And he goes, yeah, just a 12-year overnight success story. So this aspect of like, it's not easy. People recognize it sometimes when you get that brand awareness, but like there's a lot of hard work to get there and you know it. And so I think there's just a lot of those, but even my parents, just from my dad being a little more soft-spoken, being more principled and person of integrity. My mom, probably the hardest working person that I knew growing up. She's never not working hard. And then every day, my wife, she's just so wise, and my wife, we have 4 daughters together. So like if I ever need
Yeah.
any kind of grounding, like she's there every day to remind me. So at the end of the day, the big part of this aspect of being on the journey in startups is like, you just have to roll up your sleeves. You have to be willing to work hard, and you have to humble yourself. And whenever, and we all have a moment where you kind of forget that a little bit, like all of a sudden right around the corner is a slice of humble pie, and, and it gets you grounded. This sport will get you grounded really quickly the more you're in it. And I think all of that is good, because then it gets you focused on the right things. It gets you really seeing the best in people, and being able to work with the people of character who are really going to add value at the right time and the right roles, and all of that kind of goes into it. So maybe a long-winded answer, but it's a little bit all over the map, I guess.
I love it, and I appreciate you sharing. And the last little bit before we give you a chance to give us your plugs or share where we can find you and be a fan, is there any question I didn't ask you that I should have? Anything we left on the table here today before we close out?
I don't think so. This has been fun. Yeah, it's good to share, and yeah, good questions.
Appreciate it, Brett. And last little bit is, where can we be a fan of yours? Give us your LinkedIn's, your Twitters. Where can we be not only a supporter, but a fan of what you're building today?
Yeah, I mean, we're, I think, pretty easy to find. Trovata, Trove of Data, TROVATA.io, and plenty of stuff there. I'm on LinkedIn. I don't know if I even know what my link. I don't know, Brett Turner or something like that. But I think it's probably fairly easy enough to find. But yeah,
Yeah.
great to be with you.
Amazing, Brett. Well, thank you so much for being on Behind Company Lines today. I hope you enjoyed yourself.
Absolutely. Appreciate it. Thanks for
Awesome.
having me.